Work activity and its performance is one of the essential indicators of the competent employee. Learning activities and their performance is one of the essential indicators of quality courses. In order to develop learners' competence in the course, it is very important to develop the course for learning or qualification improvement with learning activities that help to develop the intended competence. MOOCs are usually activity-based courses. However, it is important to ensure that learning activities they provide address the identified competences. I am an instructor in the learning module, Foundations of Online Learning. It is the first part of an open online learning program designed to support in implementing MOOCs and MOOCs-based study programs. Therefore, by completing this module, you should be able to design a student-centered and online learning course for MOOCs. Implementation that aims to develop the learner's competence through a variety of learning activities, learner monitoring, and assessment. And the second lesson of the module is designed to develop the knowledge of different ways of developing learning activities that addresses identified competences. This knowledge is required for the relevant skill that is developed in the practical assignment of the module. So let's find out how to design learning activity that develop competences. A competence is commonly described as a combination of skills, knowledge, and attitudes that enable an individual to perform a task or an activity successfully within a given context. All three competences dimensions are related with some kind of cognitive, physical, or psychomotor or affective abilities that are demonstrated through relevant activities. These activities are also used for training in learning process as well as for assessment during or other learning. Therefore, competences development and learning must be based on various learning activities that cover all three competences dimensions. However, the instructor should start development learning activity from the final learning goal because it is a vision what one wants to accomplish overall, what is that destination of the. And the goal we usually achieve through a sequence of relevant tasks, specific learning objectives and achievements of them would be these tasks in learning that a student must achieve in order to achieve the final learning goals. In other words, learning objectives define students' needs to be able to do the tasks indented in the competences. However, the instructor should start developing learning activity from the final learning goal because it is a vision what one wants to accomplish overall, what is the final destination for learner, and the goal was usually achieved through a sequence of relevant tasks. Specific learning objectives and achievement of them would be these tasks in learning that a student must achieve in order to achieve the final learning goals. In other words, learning objectives define student needs to be able to do the task intended in the competence. Consequently, learning objectives guide instructors that learning content to select what learning and assessment activities to perform that student would be able to reach the learning objectives and goals. Moreover, learning objectives need to be related not only to students' needs to do something, but also to specific behavior. After all, behavior is required to demonstrate competence. Behavior is the way to show attitudes, and students' values, feelings, and motivations influence behavior. Learning itself we can define as a change of behavior. Therefore, instructional designers use a concept of behavioral learning objectives. This concept influences the learning paradigm according to which learning as well as learning objectives have to be actively based. The only problem caused by the use of learning objectives is that from a classical point of view, learning objectives correspond to specific statements of teaching intentions. Therefore, it is important to recognize that student-centered learning necessitates the use of learning outcomes as the only logical approach. One of the great advantages of learning outcomes is that they are clear statements of what the learner expects to achieve and how one is expected to demonstrate that achievement. Thus, learning outcomes are more precise, easier to compose. Moreover, learning outcomes and learning objectives are almost the same thing. Instructors have to design them in the right way. Usually it is a challenge for the teachers to select appropriate learning outcomes, which will lead to achieve the measurable competences. Therefore, there are various methods and guidelines how to write well-designed learning outcomes. At the very last, they must include no more than one action verbs in each outcome, including that the learner should do and to demonstrate mastery of the particular learning content. A useful starting point is writing learning outcomes in Bloom taxonomy. Bloom believed that teachers should design lessons and tasks to help students to meet stated objectives and identified three domains of learning. Within each of these domains, he recognized that there was an ascending order of complexity. It is not simply a classification. It is an effort to arrange learning achievements in a hierarchy. In this hierarchy, each level depends on the student's ability to perform at the level or levels that are below it. Here is important to say that Bloom's work is most advanced in the cognitive domains, which most instructional designers use when writing learning outcomes. Nevertheless, keeping in mind competences, the other two learning domains are also very important. Originally, Bloom made this taxonomy in the passively descriptive language. Anderson and Creswell rewrote the taxonomy in the active language. They emphasized the focus of students' activity in the form of demonstrable outcomes of the learning instead of the focus of teaching. For instance, evaluate is instead evaluation, analyze is instead analysis, and various action verbs are intended to each level to describe learning outcomes. In some cases, we can use the same action verbs for different levels, as well as various verbs that are not included in the list. Various action verbs are also intended in the affective domain, which is mainly related to the attitudes dimension of the competence. This domain is concerned with issues relating to the emotional component of learning and ranges from basic willingness to receive information to the integration of beliefs, ideas, and attitudes. Psychomotor domain and action verbs in each level are mainly related with physical skills of the competence, involving coordination of the brain and muscular activity. The taxonomy describes a progression from simple observation to mastery of physical skills in this domain. Also, the psychomotor and affective domains are used less frequent than cognitive domain in writing learning outcomes. They are also important for the instructional design. This activity-based learning is a process of learning by doing. Students as opposed to asking students to simply listen and take notes, activity-based learning encouraged them to actively participate in own learning experience through practical activities such as collaboration, problem solving, experimentation, critical analysis, and creativity. However, the first step in developing a learning activity is to define learning objectives or outcomes. Each level of the introduced taxonomy of each domain is related to different activities and educational methods. Once we have set learning outcomes, we can identify which learning methods and activities respond to our learners' needs. Thus, activity-based learning is the process of learning by doing, as opposed to asking students to simply listen and take notes activity-based learning. Encourages them to actively participate in own learning experience throughout practical activities such as collaboration, problem solving, experimentation, critical analysis, and creativity. However, the first step is developing a learning activity is to define learning objectives or outcomes. Each level of the introduced taxonomy in each domain is related to different activities and educational methods. Once we have to set learning outcomes, we can identify what learning methods and activities respond to our learners' needs. Thank you for watching, and please take the quiz of the lesson.